This is part two of the interview with Roel Bijkerk, and we ended with just about ready to go to immigrate to America. But I want to hear more about your work at the Institute for Applied Psychology in Amsterdam, right?
Right.
And how that work impacted your life, and how, because this idea of applied psychology. Did you apply this psychology to your own experience?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yes, and that's where I would like to. So tell me about this period where you were first heard about Carl Jung and his work.
Well, that was a couple of years before I actually got to work in that institute.
Okay.
You see, I had just decided after finishing high school and getting my diploma that gave me the right to go to the university. And after my father had urged me to take something at the university, rather than go to a conservatory and get entirely caught up into music, it was that I decided to go and enter the psychology department. Remember, in the Netherlands at that time, certainly, you didn't go to the university to get any kind of general education anymore. You immediately, as a freshman, entered a particular discipline. And with that, you stayed until you either graduated and became a professional, or you failed, which happened to many.
Was this selection based on any kind of aptitude testing, or was this what you were interested in?
That was, you had a right to enter university and certain departments if you had graduated successfully from a particular kind of high school. And the high school I graduated from gave you the right to just about any discipline except those that required also Latin and Greek and mythology. That was a very special kind of high school and would have taken me way too long after the war to still finish, because I had lost 4 years of school, or actually 5. Well, I got my father's advice and followed it. I'm still very thankful to him for that advice, because it really marked my life. And I decided, well, then I might as well take psychology. Maybe I'll play Beethoven better. What did I know? In any case, I decided that in the summer, after I finished high school, and in that summer I began to read more seriously some psychology, and particularly some books that were written by professors at the university I was going to, the Free University in Amsterdam. And that's where I read first about Jung, and that intrigued me. What particularly caught my attention was when the major professor at that Free University wrote about Jung. He is the great master of balance, of balancing this against that, and everything he tries to see in polarities. That is, there are always two sides to it, and you have to try to strike a balance and find that. Not just the one, not just the other, but somehow a synthesis of the two. And that for so many polarities in life. And that really intrigued me. I liked that idea. So I started reading Jung himself after having read what that professor wrote.
And was this your introduction to the field?
That was my introduction to the whole field of psychology. I didn't really know anything much about it.
You hadn't studied Freud before that?
No, I had read a little about him, and well, he was in the eyes and thoughts of just about everybody in those days. This was right after the Second World War, and he was the great psychologist for so many people. So I'd heard about him, I'd read a little bit about him, not by him. And it's in that context that I decided, okay, I'll go to a psychology department in the university. So I did that. And as soon as I got into the department, actually, in the fall of 1948, let's see, yes, 1948, I got into more contact with the ideas of Jung, because they were just beginning to be really big in the Netherlands, and particularly at the Free University, because the major professor there saw many applications of Jungian theory about personality and psychotherapy in applied psychology. So I got more and more introduced to the ideas of Carl Jung. And at first it was theory for me. It was interesting ideas. It didn't really touch me that much yet. But that came later when I became a beginning assistant. Then I found that in the practice of psychology at that institute, Jung was much bigger than Freud. And many of his major ideas about personality theory were used there in the diagnosis of people who were tested. So I got into a much more direct and intimate connection with the ideas of Jung. And when I saw it in other people as fitting ideas, I began to also notice that, of course, that would apply to me also. And, well, there came the first steps toward using Jung in a more introverted way than only to diagnose other people and children, school children, and so on. So the first steps toward Jung for me were his personality theory, which became quite popular in those days in the Netherlands, and still are quite popular. One of the most popular tests these days, I wouldn't be surprised if you had to take it once or twice, is that so-called Myers-Briggs, which is entirely based on the ideas of Jung about human personality. And well, they really began to penetrate the psychology department at that Free University where I worked,
Right.
and now also as an assistant in that institute.
Extrovert intuitive.
Yeah, well, that's is that what you are? Yeah, well, that fits. Most artists, many artists are, the intuitive is then almost always there.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are the other possibilities. And well, so I applied it, of course, to myself too. And that was very intriguing, because it also began to explain some of the problems I had had in dealing with other people. And especially as a rather introverted one in a much more extroverted culture, especially later in the United States.
Right.
I could really use the ideas of Jung. So that was the beginning.
How about some of the experiences as a young man, as watching the world at war, the atrocities that you mentioned earlier of the Japanese and public executions and dismemberment and the trauma of that period? Wasn't there a sense that the whole society was traumatized by what had just happened?
Well, you would think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But I didn't find it so.
Huh.
Maybe I was just too naive or too introverted to even think much about what was going on out there.
Okay.
I never experienced a particular trauma or traumatic sense of problems with humanity. I had enough problems being just shy, introverted, especially very easily intimidated by the presence of young females, young women. I didn't know what to do with those. I was interested, of course, like every boy, but that was really a problem. It took quite a while before I got a little bit looser, and my practice in that institute helped a lot for that too.
Okay.
I learned to deal with, talk with, interview people, including women and girls. So the practice helped me in quite a few of my own issues at that time.
Be more extroverted.
And I was too busy with those to think much about the trauma to culture or to the world.
Right.
And so,
I also remember from your stories about, particularly when you were bused to this camp that the rebel youth of Indies were put you in, and that everybody had to go through the gauntlet, and you said you were parked close to the gate, and you were small, and so
Yes.
you managed to get through that gauntlet without much damage at all.
Right.
And I also was just thinking about that you just said I didn't go through much trauma. In a way, did you feel yourself lucky compared to
Oh yeah,
what was going on for
that was
the
very
suffering
clear.
of other people?
Because I got into a cell with a whole lot of people, more than the cell was ever meant to hold, and there were quite a few with serious wounds. My cousin, who I met a little later in that jail, he was not in the same cell as mine, had gotten a spare point right in his chest, and that started to be infected, and he walked around with a big boob, as it were, for which he was teased by other young people, but
Wow.
that could have been very serious.
Yeah.
And then a classmate of mine was actually killed in that evening that I got into that jail. So, no, I saw it around me, but my goodness, I was just 17, and well, you took those things in stride. We didn't have that much attention in those days to things like post-traumatic stress syndrome. It was just part of life. And you saw a lot of violence and hunger and so on around you for years, especially during the war. And a lot of people really suffered greatly, even more so sometimes than the people who were interned by the Japanese, where at least they got a little bit of food every day. Not much, but it was some. But there were people who were really starving and going to die because of hunger. And you saw some of that on the streets of the city where we were at that time, Surabaya. So it wasn't anything new, all that violence, that I suddenly felt much more personally, because we were picked up by the rebels, the young Pemuda, but it wasn't something so unusual. It wasn't something so terribly new, and so it wasn't as much of a trauma, probably. At least I never experienced it as such a big thing to happen to me.
Right.
It was part of life. And I think in those days we were a little bit more matter of fact than later when psychology began to discover all those problems that people can have emotionally many years later even.
Right.
And so today it's not uncommon in the Netherlands for veterans from that period of the Second World War with the Japanese occupation to begin to suffer traumatic throwbacks to that time, which they had never had before because they were too busy living.
I witnessed that in my uncles.
Yeah?
Deafness and blindness.
Oh, yeah.
And it somehow, when they talked about the beatings that they would get from the Japanese, because they were Dutch military, right? So
Yeah,
they were
yeah.
in military concentration camps. They would not demonstrate any pain from the beatings, which made them, some case, beat them more.
Yes.
But they were just like, you know, I can take this. And they internalized it and didn't show the effects of it until years later, where it was really tragic.
And I wondered about that for myself, but I never afterwards either
Okay.
experienced that.
Right. Did you experience any prejudice at all when you were, because it sounds again like you were given these educational opportunities, you got to go through the HBS, the elite high school, and then into the university. Was the acceptance of people that had Indonesian or Indies heritage, were they accepted in Nederland freely?
Not all of them.
Okay.
No, there were three waves, you might say. And I belonged in the first wave. That was very soon after the war ended. And those were mostly people who did have a lot of ties, personally or through their parents, to the Netherlands, as in my family. My father was born and bred in the Netherlands, and he was as white as they come, blue eyes and everything. So of course he didn't experience prejudice. My mother had spent her whole adolescence and young adulthood in the Netherlands, being educated in a Dutch family. So she never experienced anything in the Netherlands of prejudice and discrimination and so on. And that was the case for almost all of those who were in the first wave of the end of 1945 and 1946, especially the first half of 1946. They were immediately, fairly easily integrated in the Netherlands, and they had no problems, except money, but not in the sense of discrimination or prejudices. So I never experienced any of that, not in the Netherlands, and I must say not later either in the United States. I was just a Dutchman,
Right.
period. Even though I had some Indonesian blood, but who cared? That didn't matter. All my education, my speech particularly, was as Dutch as can be. There was nothing strange or foreign about it. No accent. Spoke better Dutch than many people in the Netherlands did. The High Dutch, if you will. So no, I didn't have any problem. The second wave, that was in the late 40s and early 50s, began to experience that because there were more people in that group who had more Indonesian blood in them and background. There were more who did not have so much contact with the Dutch before the war as we in the first wave had. So there was a beginning. And then the third wave got by far most of the prejudice, and there was a lot of it, because they were much darker. They came after they at first had chosen to stay in Indonesia, when they had a choice. When Sukarno got power in the end of 49, people like me too, I had that choice too, had the choice. You could become Indonesian in the new Republic of Indonesia, or you could remain Dutch as you were already. And that was true also for many quite dark-skinned people in the Indies, who were often more than 50% native blood and looked it and spoke it because they had much more of an accent. They had grown up all their life in the Indies and they wanted to stay there. So they got Indonesian citizenship. But then came the trouble of the Netherlands versus Indonesia about New Guinea. The Netherlands wanted to keep that part of New Guinea that had been Dutch before the war. The Indonesians felt, we are now what the Dutch East Indies were, that includes New Guinea. And from 1950 on to 1962, there was trouble. And Sukarno and his government became more and more filled with animosity toward everything that was Dutch. And they began to show that to people who were still Dutch. And there were a couple 100,000 of them in Indonesia. mostly dark-skinned, mostly closer actually to the native cultures than to the Dutch culture, had never been in the Netherlands, didn't know the Netherlands, saw the Indies, now Indonesia, as their country. And that became so bad at a given moment, in terms also of just jobs and money and healthcare and all of those things that a citizen expects, that they decided, well, we better get out of here. For instance, the Kui that I had mentioned before to you is an example of that. But in the later 1950s, let's say from 1955 to 1962, happened in Indonesia was more and more prejudice and persecution of people who had chosen to remain in Indonesia. And that's when many of them decided, well, I better get to the Netherlands. I'm still a Dutchman.
They were Dutch citizens.
They had
right?
been Dutch citizens, even though many of them had become Indonesian citizens, but they could revoke that.
Okay.
They got that chance from the Dutch. And that's the third wave. And those people at first experienced pretty extreme prejudice in the Indies, in Indonesia, and then again in the Netherlands, because they didn't look Dutch at all, didn't sound like Dutch, didn't have the culture of Dutch, didn't cook like the Dutch. They cooked stuff that stank for many Dutchmen when they had to be housed there. So they experienced a great deal of it. And that's why a number of those people later migrated away again from the Netherlands and went to places like Canada, but especially also now California in the United States.
Okay.
There are tens of thousands of those Dutchmen who came to the United States, who ended up on the West Coast, particularly California, and eventually became Americanized, naturalized, but tried to still keep some of the Indies culture, as they called it, for themselves. I had a cousin who did the same thing. He could have stayed in the Netherlands because he belonged in the same category as I, but he didn't like the Netherlands. He wanted to go back to something more like the Indies, warmer, larger, bigger, mountains. You know there are mountains in the Netherlands. That's why the bikes are so important there. At least you can with a bike go anywhere in the Netherlands. But there are many right now in the California particularly, but also Arizona and so on, the west coast and the lower southwest. So that's the story about prejudice. So
I'm just wondering about the Indian cuisine, Indonesian or West Indies cuisine, so adopted by the Netherlands, right? It's almost the national cuisine now.
especially the Indonesian.
Yeah.
Every little town or township will probably have some, and then often Chinese Indies restaurant,
Yeah.
and it's very popular there.
Right.
If you go to a Dutch shop here in Grand Rapids, there are two of them, you'll find a lot of the spices, especially, that the Dutch learned to appreciate
Right.
from the Indonesian cuisine.
Yeah. So let's just go back a little bit to your study of Jung. Did you ever go hear him speak anywhere, or?
That's been one of my great regrets. I had the opportunity once in Amsterdam, when he came and visited and gave a couple lectures, to go and hear him, and I was just a beginning student, in my second year maybe. And I decided, another old man, I'm not going to listen to him, I'm going to play chess, which was my passion at the time. And the violin, of course, still in those years. Those first several years, I had not yet decided to keep psychology as a hobby, an interest, and I still wanted to become a violinist.
Yeah.
And chess had really taken to my fancy, and I played that a lot. So I didn't go and hear Jung, and later I regretted that very much. But he was then, this was in the 50s, he was already in his early 80s. He died in 61, 86 years old. So in the middle 50s, he was already 80 years old. And to me, that was so old. I mean, who wants to hear that?
Right.
And then with that accent, probably, he was of course German speaking. I later saw many interviews with him. By the way, at that memorial for my wife, the music that was chosen for the beginning was one that for both my wife and I were very strongly associated with Jung, because it was the music that was played as the introduction to the most famous interview that Jung ever gave at the very end of his life. So there was an association there. I didn't have the time to explain that later in my eulogy, but you were there, so I thought I should tell you.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. And that was a piece your son played?
No, that was later.
Okay.
He played something to his own liking.
Okay.
But I played a piece at the very beginning that was taken from that interview.
As people were sitting and coming in.
As they were coming in.
Yes.
And that's what I ended after my eulogy
Okay.
too. So it was sort of
Bookends.
rounding out the
Yeah,
whole thing.
I like that. I
Yeah.
like doing that. I call it bookends, just
Yeah.
a container, right?
Yeah.
Which is one of the things that I felt like learned from Jung and from the idea of myths being containers of meaning,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
That you carry with you. And it's almost like once you look in there and there's always other objects that you missed previously, like a story, a detail shows up. So how about the Jung Institute? Did you ever, because
No, my wife and I, neither one of us ever became a, what shall I call it, a card-carrying Jungian.
Okay.
We went there. I visited that institute in Chicago, for instance, a number of times, and went to workshops there. But we didn't feel like we wanted to be identified that much with the movement that came after Jung.
Okay.
As Jung himself didn't like to be too much identified with that. He was not the great proponent for the Jungian movement. He didn't resist it, but he didn't particularly propagate it either, at least not for a start. Actually, he's known to have said sometimes, well, I'm glad I'm Jung, not a Jungian.
That's funny, because I got caught up in that movement. I think it might have been the first time I met you or heard of you was at Fountain Street Church with that film series by, what's his name?
Marie-Louise von Franz.
That was the subject, but it was a guy named Boaz.
He made the movie.
He made the movie.
He was a Jungian himself.
Right.
He was a psychotherapist and a filmmaker, and he managed to get Marie-Louise von Franz to sit actually twice.
Right. It was fascinating.
For the whole series.
Yeah.
And she became, after Jung, the great dream interpreter.
Right.
Nobody has ever become like Jung himself. I mean, friend or foe, they agreed with that.
Right.
What he managed to do with dreams has not been replicated by anybody. But Marie-Louise von Franz came close.
Yeah.
She became, in that respect, to some people, Jung too. Jung the second.
Well, and that was kind of the thing about people were then, she's known as a Jungian. And when I first heard of you and Ini as Jung, people say, oh, they're Jungians. That's how they described you, and it was like the only Jungians I ever knew in West Michigan, Ini and Roelof Bijkerk. And at that time, I even think when Ini was at William James, that I was interested in, becoming an analysand, and I didn't pursue it, or she wasn't seeing any new people at the time.
That's possible. She got pretty busy.
Yeah, a friend of mine, David, Julie Gottlieb, was on faculty at James, and her.
Oh yeah, I know about Gottlieb. But
Yeah,
I didn't know his wife.
Dick Gottlieb, and I think they were both Julie and Dick knew of Ini and probably were important to getting her to come to James,
That's
So-
possible. Yeah.
So this is kind of why my line of questioning. James Hillman I met because of the men's movement in the 80s, which also started at Fountain Street Church. And, people introduced him as, when he was the head of the Jung Institute in Zurich for a while.
For a while, yes.
He would speak, an audience of like 10,000 people would
Oh,
come
yeah.
to hear
Yeah.
him, so
Yeah.
hugely influential, and still for me, I have a deep feeling of, I was actually talking to Anne and Jeannie when I left last time about this idea of mythological thinking. And that was one of the ways that they spoke about the men's movement, was the mythopoetic
Oh yeah.
men's movement,
sure.
that it was in, I hate this, in our country the word myth has become synonymous with lie, and yet it's so much more important that we understand about myth. And Joseph Campbell was very influential for me too with that myth and metaphor, in containers of meaning. So I wanted to pursue that conversation with you a little bit and hear, how it influenced.
Oh
you.
yeah. Well, that influenced me also from the very beginning. That notion that there are not just two possibilities. Something's either true or it's a lie, or at least a mistake. And then Jung, from the start, introduced me to the idea that there's a third possibility, that something may not be literally true, but in other ways very much true, even more so perhaps than what is literally true.
Yeah.
That a story about something that didn't happen may be more important than the story about something that actually did happen. And that was a real eye-opener for me. And also that idea that you mentioned a little earlier about the rounding out. In myth, of course, you have that famous snake that at the end
Consumes
bites
itself.
his own
Yeah.
tail. It gets all rounded up. And actually that was a little also in my eulogy when I at the end quoted those lines of T.S. Eliot that after all our exploring, we finally arrive where we started. And then know the place for the first time. That's of course the important qualifier there.
That's a beautiful idea.
You don't
yeah.
just go back. You have rounded it all out, and then you come to a much better understanding of what it was all about from the very beginning.
Mhm.
At the beginning, you didn't understand that. You didn't realize that. And so it is with life itself. That at first, as you go through it, it's just one damn thing after another, as Plato sometimes is supposed to have said. Please don't ask me where he said that, I have no idea. But then, at the end, you see that from the very start, as you began life, it seems like there was a line in it, there was a meaning in it from the beginning, you just didn't see it. Now, of course, there's nothing new in that idea. Schopenhauer wrote a strange article about that already a couple hundred years ago. That at the end you look back and then it's almost like you simply followed a plan. While where you were in it, you had no idea that things made sense the way they developed. It's just one accident after another. So yeah, no, that's very Jungian.
Yeah.
And Innie and I felt very much in tune with that. But I would say then there's an emphasis on the original Jung. We never felt, like so many Jungians today do, that you have to move beyond that. You have to move farther forward. Like, for instance, Hillman did. He went beyond the notion of archetypes as Jung developed it, and he made for a new kind of psychology his work, what he called archetypal psychology, which is not the same as Jung.
Okay.
I've never felt that, neither has Innie. Jung enough was, I mean, Jung by himself was enough to try to understand somewhat, and we still haven't to this day. And any time a Jungian starts talking about, well, we have moved beyond Jung now, I shut up. I don't share that.
Okay. Was this part of the attraction between you and Innie? Did you have these conversations? Is that what kind of...
Well, I guess that we discovered in each other an interest that we already had. She had started her Jungian analysis with an official Jungian psychotherapist, a psychiatrist in the Netherlands, Schuurman, who had written some books about it too. She had started that before she really got to know me,
Okay.
or I got to know her. So then we discovered that we had a great deal in common. She was much more the practical one, approaching it also from the emotional side. I was much more the theoretical one. But in between, there was a whole lot that we had in common, and we discovered in each other the relevance of many of the notions of Jung about typology and projection and that kind of thing.
Right. So tell me a little bit about how you guys came to the decision to leave Nato. It sounds like you had good positions, and yet you came up with this plan. Tell me how that came about.
Well, that's a beautiful example of unintended consequences of something that seems to be just something that happens to happen and has no further meaning. 2 years before I got that invitation to come to Grand Rapids, Calvin College, the chairman of the psychology department at Calvin College got a sabbatical and used that sabbatical to go to the Netherlands to find out how at that free university, which was in some respects sort of the older model for Calvin College, how they did psychology there at that free university. And he came to Amsterdam, and he was going to just sort of go along every day for the sabbatical of his half year and find out exactly just what we did in that institute in particular, but the department in general.
Was the institute associated with the university?
Oh yeah,
Oh.
It started as the Laboratory for Applied Psychology of the Free University.
Okay.
It was an institute of the Free University,
Okay.
founded by Professor Waterink, who was then the professor in psychology at the Free University. So yes, it was entirely tied to the university. And Waterink told this Dr. Daling, who came on his sabbatical to Amsterdam, that, well, yeah, to have a really good department of psychology at a college or university level, you needed some applied psychology with it, because in the Netherlands that was big, much more so and earlier than in the United States.
Explain that a little
For
bit.
the general public, the military in the United States had actually started applied psychology in the First World War. And all of a sudden, a couple million young American males had to be divided up over who knows how many different divisions and departments and platoons to do what in the American Army. And that's when they began to develop the tests for placing personnel here, there, or the other place. So they had started that, but that was not picked up by the general public so much afterwards. But that was the case in the Netherlands already before the Second World War. So there were other psychological institutes from universities and also independent ones who offered those kinds of possibilities for the general public, particularly at first for schools. Because in the Netherlands, education was much more diverse and stratified than in the United States. There were, after elementary school, many different possibilities for secondary education, and certainly after secondary education, there were many more different types of schools and diplomas and all that than in the United States.
Right.
So applied psychology was a big thing in the Netherlands fairly early, at the end of the 20s and in the 30s that began. And after the Second World War, it really started to bloom because the Netherlands was changing. It was a planned kind of change from an agricultural to a more commercial and industrial society. And for that, you needed to know where to place people. And so applied psychology, both at the school level, at the lower age levels, and also at the level of business and industry, there needed to be developed much more of a selection system based on tests and evaluations by people. And that's why those institutes grew after the war. Well, that's why that professor of mine, Watering, told Deling, the professor from here, if you want to have a good department of psychology, you have to try to develop some kind of application of psychology,
Right.
because that's the future.
Is that still true in the Netherlands in terms of their educational system, you think?
They have
That's
tried.
stratified?
They have tried to change that a bit more toward the American model,
Okay,
but it has not been all that greatly successful.
right.
So it is true you get a much broader range of topics now taught at universities than before. And high schools have become quite a little less diversified than before, as far as I understand what has happened there in the last 20 years, when I wasn't there.
Right.
But it's still pretty much so that they need a lot of testing and then placement of people here, there, or
Right.
the other
It
place.
sounds a lot like, and I don't know the history of this, but, Skinner and behavioral psychology was kind of, when did that come up on the scene? Because it sounds like applied psychology is about controlling populations, segmenting people, that it's very much about control.
Well, Skinner is a topic entirely in its own right.
Right, but
He
he comes out of somewhere.
Well, he came out of regular experimental psychology at the universities
Right.
here. He was at Indiana, and then later went to Harvard, of course.
But what I'm saying is,
But he didn't come out of applied psychology.
okay, but applied, see, because behavioralism seems like applied psychology to
Well,
me.
yes, but at the university level, in the experimental laboratory, it's the control of behavior generally
Right.
that they were after, not so much school children only, but that was a start.
Right.
And that's when Skinner developed his entirely new kind of technique for controlling behavior entirely by the outside, not the inside of the organism.
Okay.
As he later was fond of saying, all causes of behavior lie outside the organism.
Right.
So if you want to know why people do what they do, all people, and not only people, but all animals too, you look at what their environment did to them.
Right.
And that's not what the Dutch model was at all.
And
There was-
you hung on to that interior
Oh yeah,
model.
oh yeah.
That there's an inside, right?
Oh
That's
yeah,
important.
that actually most of what eventually causes behavior lies inside the organism. And now that's beginning to be discovered in the last 30, 40 years
Right.
in America too,
Right.
with particularly the development of things like DNA and what that means in the life of people.
Right.
So Skinner was huge after the war for a while, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and
Did
80s.
those influences end up in Nederland?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
yeah, but as one of many, not with the dominance
Okay.
that it got here, and that's why American psychology split. You know, there are two national organizations of psychology in the United States. There are many schools that are calling themselves professional schools of psychology, and they are much more oriented toward the individual, inside the individual, and then you have the outside. The academic psychologists and the other psychologists often don't talk to each other anymore. That's very regrettable, I think, but well,
Right.
that's how it is right now.
Okay, so this guy from Kelvin, who's on sabbatical,
He's on sabbatical.
and you
and
meet him. At
he
some,
wants to know how do you do things around here, also at the Institute. And so they say, hey, Bijkerk, why don't you become his guide here?
okay.
I don't know why they picked me. Maybe because I spoke a little bit more English than most.
And he had no Dutch connection at all, did he?
Yes, his father was an immigrant here.
Oh, okay.
You can still find a dealing court around Marne there on the west side, where his father started a farm. And he grew up on a farm, and he was still a farmer at heart in many ways. But he did get a PhD in philosophy at U of M, and then he was asked to start teaching psychology at Calvin College when he applied there. But it was all from the more philosophical side. And here he was told by the professor in Amsterdam, where they all looked up to, that, well, if you want to really develop a good psychology department, you have to get some applied stuff in there too. Well, he was assigned to me as the one to guide him around and have him sit in and just about everything I was doing. I was a first-class assistant by that time.
Okay.
And so I did a lot of my own testing and counseling and interviewing and writing reports and all
And were
that
you
kind of
and
thing.
Eni together already at this time? Were you?
Yes, we were beginning
Okay.
to. That was the year before we decided to really get together.
Right.
That he was there, the beginning of '56, I believe. So he got to know me and I got to know him, and we got along very well. I had dinner with him and his wife a few times at his home. But then after I have here, he left. And that was that, as far as I was concerned. Oh, it was nice to have met you and have a good time on your trip back to America. Well, bye. That was the story for me. But apparently he, here in Grand Rapids, managed to convince the president, Spoelhoff, and the board of trustees or the Board of Control, I think it was called, that, well, that psych department had better get going and start thinking about developing also something like a little institute, at least for students, to get some practical applications to see. And they took the advice and said, well, then, where do we find one? Well, here around in America, a Christian Reformed one couldn't be found, because they either went into psychotherapy or they went into straight experimental work and teaching, maybe after that, or at some laboratory. Well, how about the Netherlands then? And that's when he said, well, I think I know one. Apparently, that's
He
what
had
I
never
could...
talked to you about this when he was here.
No,
though.
no.
We
There was
didn't-
no plan at Calvin College,
Okay.
as far as I later came to understand. But apparently, the story became, well, if you want to develop a psychological department, you better try to branch out into more than just teaching theory.
Right.
And they also had, as a visiting professor, my major professor Watering for a half year. And he must have said the same thing then while he was here. I didn't know about that, but that was. So they inquired apparently of Watering, hey, do you have somebody there? And Watering agreed with Daling, apparently, that I would be a good subject
Okay.
for that possibility. And so there came a letter from Calvin College, would I come and teach for 2 years at Calvin College? That was clearly a sort of, let's try that one out. Well, that worked to their satisfaction, apparently, because that's when I got the offer to become a tenured track professor, when I could.
After the 2 years or before? That was part of the letter.
Well, I was given to understand that they were planning to do that. But I couldn't stay. If I could have stayed, they would have made that offer right away.
Okay.
But they said, well, you have to get your PhD first. That's that extra academic degree that they had in the Netherlands. And you cannot stay here. They tried, because the law said if you had been in the United States as a visitor, you could not change directly into immigrant status.
Oh.
They tried. They even tried Jerry Ford to make a plea for me as an exception. I understood later. But no, it didn't work. You had to leave the country for at least 2 years. And so I said, well, that actually is my plan anyway, because I do want to get that extra degree, that official doctor degree from the Netherlands.
At the Free University.
At the Free University. Well, it didn't have to be the Free University by law, but that would have been my choice. I had an idea what I wanted it to be about, and Watering agreed with that idea. It was a much more general theoretical idea about the discipline of psychology, or the science, if you will. And remember, in Europe at that time, science included both the humanities and the hard sciences. It was Wissenschaft. And you could have Wissenschaft of just about anything, and it was science. But of course, in America, you couldn't have the hard science of ethics. That was a chapter in the book of philosophy. And philosophy was not a science. But in the Netherlands at that time, as in Germany, Wissenschaft meant the whole range of academic endeavors.
Like
Discipline.
Wissenschaft,
Wissenschaft.
which is
Yeah.
knowing, knowing.
Yeah, and the
And
making,
the-
shaft means to engender, to make, to develop, to pursue. And that could be in the sciences, of course.
Right.
But earlier than that, it had been in what were the humanities. That
Right.
was all
Also
Wissenschaft.
occupational too, right? Does that word fit as an occupational? And Schaf is an occupation, and
No, it was
No?
more academic.
okay.
The background of application, yes. The
I like that
background
word,
of
though.
professional.
Wissenschaft.
So for a high-level professional,
Uh-huh.
you wanted somebody who had a wissenschaftliche background, a scientific background, if you translated it literally. But in America and the English world, Anglo-Saxon world generally, the word science became more and more narrowed to become the experimental, laboratory-based physical sciences, and not Musikwissenschaft or something like that.
Yeah. So then, so then you decided to immigrate then, or was?
Well, I went back to the Netherlands,
Oh wait,
and
you came and spent 2 years.
here, yes. Then I went back to the
With
Netherlands.
Ini, you came?
Oh yeah,
As
oh, yeah.
visitors?
As visitors,
Oh, you
yeah.
came as visitors.
With an 8-week-old infant, our first one.
Okay.
She got to be 2 months old on board of the ship that we took to America.
What ship? Do you remember the ship you took?
De Grote Beer.
Oh, Grote Meer.
De
Okay.
Grote Beer.
Grote Beer. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
'Cause
That was
we
one
did
of the.
Rhine-Dam and the Maas-Dam.
Oh, those were the big ones.
The Holland
those,
American line.
the Holland America line. Those were big ones,
Yeah.
huge ones. Cruise ships before the war, and pretty soon after the war again. Too.
Right.
But there were many other smaller ships,
Oh.
quite seaworthy, and the Grote Beer was one of them. And had served during the war for troop transport and
Right.
so
So
on.
how was that 2 years here then? And you lived. Where did you live?
Well, we first stayed with the Darling
Okay.
and his family, and then we found the house of somebody who already taught at Calvin College, but went away for a year to study for a PhD somewhere in the States. I think it was at Michigan State, but I'm not sure of
So
that.
56, 57, what year?
No, 58 to 60.
Okay.
That was when we were here. As I was a visiting lecturer.
Right. How was your English by then? Did you
Well,
do some
that-
extra study in English?
I was fairly good in comprehending it. I had read many, many books in English, both British and American. I was very fond of detective stories, and I read them once a week at least, and other more literary kind of things. So I listened to the BBC a lot, which in the Netherlands was very easy. And we didn't have FM radio then. It was all shortwave or midwaves. And so I often listened to the BBC, and I liked particularly things like 20 questions. You know, identify within 20 questions. So I had learned a lot of comprehension of English. So that was not so much the problem, but the problem was speaking it. Now with Dr. Daling, Professor Daling, I had had some experience, and later in the Netherlands, my Australian sister-in-law, the wife of my older brother, came with him to the Netherlands, so I had some practice there, but it was difficult at first. From Ini, much more difficult than for me,
Right.
Because she didn't have all the comprehension that I had.
Right.
But I remember very well my first set of lectures that first semester at Calvin College. I would write it out with a Dutch-English dictionary, most of my lecture for the next day or 2 days, and then I would use those notes, and they were more than notes, it was almost written out in class. Must have been horrible for the students, because my accent was, of course, still an awful lot worse than it is today. And but they were so gracious, and they helped me. And well, yeah, then I had to practice every day, all day long, at school with colleagues and with students. I had to speak English.
Were these advanced courses, or were they more
No, there was
introductory?
intro psych, and I think the first was abnormal psych or child psychology.
Okay.
I taught those three in the beginning, and then later, in the second year, I introduced a course in what was horribly called abnormal child psychology, which is really child psychopathology. But the word abnormal had been instituted in American colleges. It was, of course, the psychology was not abnormal. Well, maybe it was in some ways, but well, it was psychology of abnormal people. I didn't like the word abnormal in the first place, but okay, what do you do as a poor little Dutchman coming in here? So you teach abnormal psychology.
And was this a full teaching load?
It was a full teaching load, yeah. 12 hours of full-time of teaching, yeah. 6 days a week. That was a culture shock. The first year that I was here, I had to teach on Saturday morning. And then at 8 o'clock, I mean, no civilized person at a university would ever think of starting a class at 8 o'clock in the morning, let alone on Saturday. But here that was normal. Okay, I had adjusted to more things in my life, so I did that. After the first year, at least I could usually do pretty well with just some major notes to base my lectures on. I could improvise more the speaking of it. And so after those 2 years, I began to be able, or at the end of those 2 years, I began to be able to just have some ideas in my head and then leave it to the gods what I would actually talk about in class. But that took me 2 years before I got to that point. Later I talked so much, so easily that they wanted to shut me up. But
so Eni is taking care of
Anne
at this
yeah,
time?
and then the second year we were here, at the end of the first summer, our second one was born here.
Oh.
And that was not an easy pregnancy, and it was, he was early, 5 weeks early, something like that. So she had her hands full with those 2 infants. Fortunately, for the second year, my mother came over, and she was a very great help for the whole second year. And she went back with us to the Netherlands after that year. I should say in those 2 years, it was really because of Eni that I became eligible as an immigrant. I didn't, because there was still the quota system in those years, and the quota for people born in the Indies, Indonesia, was so pitifully small, it would have taken me 20, 30 years before I would have become eligible, even as one of the privileged ones who had had higher education. For the Netherlands, the quota for immigration per year, that is the quota here in the United States for Dutch-born people, was, I think, something like 3,000 could come. And then there were exceptions for many more, for all kinds of reasons. But for all of Asia, including India and China, it was 1,500 a year. Can you imagine? $1.5 billion people there, and 1,500 of them, if they waited long enough, per year could then become regular immigrants to the United States.
But because Eni was your
Eni
wife,
was European, and they had just changed the law here. in that first year when we were back in the Netherlands. And the new law here, or the change in the law here, said if one of a couple, married couple, became eligible, the other one could come too. That had not been the case before. That's why there were so many married, but still single immigrants here, sometimes for years, especially from Asia. Even with all the exceptions that were made for Vietnamese and so on. That the man would come over, but the woman wouldn't. The man had a job, that's why he could come over. The woman was the housewife, and she couldn't come over. Sometimes it would take years before the family could finally come over too.
So you came back to Nederland after your 2 years at Calvin, and then decided to immigrate.
Then decided to try to immigrate.
And was there an offer from Calvin for you to
basically, yes.
Okay.
If you get your PhD there in the Netherlands, you have a job here.
Right. So were you working on that then? That time that you came back, did you start working on your PhD right away?
Well, yes and no.
Were you able to go right back to your same job at the
No. I got a job at the university to teach.
Okay.
And to give examinations to students for my major professor. He got old by that time. He was in his 60s and he was looking at retirement. And well, there were many more students than earlier in his career. So he needed an assistant to give exams for him. So I started to give oral exams to most of his students in regular classes. And I gave 2 courses in the psychology department. One at the undergraduate level and one at the graduate level.
How about Eni at this time? Is she still just...
She was still busy because
with the kids?
Before long, when we were back, she became pregnant again.
Oh, wow.
So number 3 was coming.
Yeah. Right.
And she was pretty busy.
But did you start working on the PhD part then at that time?
As I said, yes and no. Yes, in terms of study. I read and I read and I read because I wanted to make a really theoretical contribution to the discipline, because you're supposed to make a contribution to the discipline. And I wanted to make one of a more general theoretical sort, not a particular topic and then do research on it and then write it on that. But I wanted to talk about the problem of methodology in psychology generally. And for that, I wanted a historical approach to show how over the centuries that issue of how do you do psychology came about and led to all kinds of different ideas and practices. And I wanted to put that sort of in order and have an idea about how it might develop in the future. So it was a pretty ambitious theoretical kind of thing. And I needed to study a lot of history, particularly philosophical history, and also the history of psychology as it had developed in medicine, in education, in the industrial world, and so on. So I studied hard, but I didn't write a word. That didn't come about until Christmas of the second year in the Netherlands. And my goal had been 2 years. And that should be it. The late summer of the second year should be done. I should get my degree. And I remember I got more and more antsy, of course, because I didn't write anything. I had some notes here and some notes there. And I remember it was just after Christmas of that second year I started writing like a madman, because I had the framework in my head. And within a half year I had written the book, the theoretical sort of historical approach to the problem of methodology in psychology. And my professor rather accepted that, as did a couple other professors. So then I had to get it published, and found a small publisher, printer publisher, and well, it got done just in time. And the awarding of the PhD had to be postponed by the university for several reasons. They couldn't get all the people together who would have to be there, professors, senior professors.
Like your committee or something, right?
Yeah, it was a large committee at large of the university, not just psychology professors, but also professors in other disciplines, particularly, of course, in my case, philosophy and education, because that's what most of my dissertation was about. So that finally happened in October. In the meantime, Calvin College had to find two people to give my lectures, which started in September, until I would finally be able to come. I did have passage ready. We were ready to go, and finally in early October, it came about. It was still in those days a big ceremony for the whole university, as it were. It didn't get too many PhDs, and it was wonderful. So I got it, and very soon after that, we stepped on board and left for the United States. No, not on board. Yeah, on board a plane.
Oh, you
This time it was by plane.
Wow.
And that was a terrible experience for my wife, because there were 3 little kids. The oldest was 4, the youngest was less than a year, and she was pregnant with number 4. Well, you know, the Dutch are a little slow at the beginning, but boy, once they get going, things start moving. So we had 4 kids in 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, and then that was enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you had a position waiting for you at Calvin then.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was the start of the second semester in like January? Or?
No,
It's
right
October
away.
now.
The day we came on a Friday
Okay.
in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
October, the end of October 1962, that was. And when we left the Netherlands Friday morning, we didn't know if we would arrive in a country with nuclear war or not.
Wow.
Well, it wasn't yet. And of course, Saturday was no school already by then. Saturdays, at least, they cut out of the regular roster. And so I went to church, Reverend Boomsma at Calvin Church there on Ethel, quite close to the campus of Calvin College in those days. And he told us that there had been a sort of truce for the moment, and there was not going to be war. Well, it was that Friday night that things were really on the edge, as we much later discovered.
Right.
And it was really Robert Kennedy and Khrushchev who managed to avoid
John Kennedy.
that. No, it was Robert
Oh, it was
Kennedy.
Robert?
Yeah, he was the delegate for his brother,
Oh, okay.
who couldn't start doing too much, as it were, quietly and underhandedly. But Robert Kennedy was the one who got in silent touch with somebody from the Russian
As Attorney
side,
General.
as Attorney General,
Okay.
and through that one to Khrushchev. And they concocted that deal where Russia would pull their missiles out of Cuba, and the United States would pull out missiles from places like Turkey and somewhere in Middle Europe there. And so both sides gave a little and took a little. And at least there was no nuclear war, but
Right.
it was really nip and tuck because most of the people around Khrushchev wanted it, and most of the people around John Kennedy wanted it, to be the first one to strike.
Right.
So it wasn't until that Friday night, as I understood many years later,
Right.
when they finally
How
opened up
close.
books and so on,
How close it actually came. Yeah.
how close it actually came. And that there were commanders, Russian commanders on the field in Cuba with a smaller, actually nuclear arsenal that they had the freedom to use if America would try to invade Cuba again, as had gone before in the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
We didn't know anything about that at the time.
Right.
All we knew was no war.
Right.
And that Monday I went to class.
Monday you went to class. So they had found somebody temporary
Two colleagues in the sex department
before you could
who,
come. Right?
yeah, who I wrote beforehand, so that had to be 10 days
Right.
before, what I would talk about in class and major notes about that.
And you now are officially immigrant too. Both of
Yes.
us are immigrants.
Yes.
Right. Still Dutch citizens.
Yeah, in New York we got the green card.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And
Well,
I
I
kept the
think-
green card.
Yep. I think this is a good time to stop.
Stop for the moment?
Stop for the moment. We've been going for almost an hour and 16 minutes.
Yeah. No kidding.
Yes. It's wonderful conversation. And we'll pick it up.
Yeah, is this what you want?
It is.
I mean, I just talked spontaneously. I didn't prepare.
No.
Okay.